Hello, and welcome to the Beverly Hills Bar Association's MCLE presentation entitled Business Valuation and Damages Calculations During COVID-19. This presentation is brought to you by the litigation section of BHBA and is co-sponsored by the tax section. My name is Brian Bergman. I'm a member of the BHBA litigation section executive committee and a real estate litigation partner at Bergman, Dacey, Goldsmith. Before we get to the presentation, I want to let you know that materials from this presentation will be emailed to you tomorrow, and you will receive MCLE paperwork by email after the presentation as well. If there's time, I will present questions from the audience to the speakers. We also hope that you will join us for future BHBA webinars, including Running a Virtual Law Practice, the Do's and Don'ts. That presentation will be on January 7th at 12:30 p.m. Now I'm pleased to introduce our two speakers today. Jeff Kinrich is a managing principal at Analysis Group. He is a certified public accountant and is accredited in business valuation. Mr. Kinrich has over 3 decades of litigation consulting experience in areas such as financial and economic analysis, accounting, business valuation, and statistics. He specializes in damage quantification and valuation in the areas of commercial litigation and intellectual property. And as you will note, he has a fantastic COVID beard right now, so the difference between his picture and him, it is him, it's just the COVID beard. Will Thomsen is a director at Grobstein Teeple. He is a chartered financial analyst and accredited senior appraiser with over 25 years of experience providing business valuations and economic analysis to businesses ranging from small family-owned enterprises to Fortune 1000 companies across numerous industries. Mr. Thomsen provides economic damage assessment and expert testimony for commercial and employment disputes. I'd like to turn it over to Will and to Jeff.
Thank you very much. So let me just start this off quickly by saying what we're going to talk about today. Even though the topic is about damages and valuation in the context of COVID-19, we're actually going to spend a fair amount of time talking about damages in general, because in order to talk about what happens with COVID-19, you have to have something to compare to. So we'll start with that. Then we'll talk about 2 versions of COVID. One, damages from COVID-19. And second, just ordinary commercial damages in light of COVID-19, that is having to deal with the economic environment we are in. Now, damages as a matter of measurement can be measured by either lost profits or business valuation approaches. And we will talk about both. To a large extent, I will talk about the lost profits piece and will talk about the business valuation piece, but there is overlap in what we're going to do. So our scope here is, first, will talk to the issue about what has COVID-19 done to the economy, both the economy as a whole and to impact on the markets. Then I'll talk about some lost profits and business valuation issues, as shown on the slide. I won't read them to you. And talk about what happens between a world without COVID-19 and a world with COVID-19. And then we'll talk about how one goes about measuring lost profits, sort of what the general approaches are. And we'll talk about the 3 sort of classic approaches. Then we'll turn to business valuation and talk about how value is usually derived, what drives value, and how COVID-19 could impact business valuation. And then we'll talk about a magic word, EBITDA, and I'll let Will explain what that is. Finally, we will finish with some examples of COVID-19 related litigation and how, and some things about measuring both damages and causation. These will mostly be conceptual. We're not going to give you actual examples of real cases, but hopefully they will be illustrative and meaningful. So with that, Will, it's yours.
All right. Thank you very much, Jeff. And thank you, Brian. So we're just going to start with a little discussion of how COVID-19 has impacted the economy. And it is no surprise it's been had a profound impact this whole year. The U.S. officially declared a recession in February of this year. The GDP declined by about 5% in the first quarter, and which is a little unusual to declare a recession with just one quarter decline. But what you saw was when you saw such a profound decrease in the following quarter, you can see why. The GDP fell off a cliff, over 31% decline in the second quarter. Now there was a recovery, a pretty strong recovery in the third quarter as shutdowns were lifted, at least temporarily. But as we'll discuss, we have a ways to go. Looking at the U.S. unemployment rate, you see, and this is directly related to the pandemic and the imposed shutdowns. April had a horrendously high unemployment rate of almost 15%, and it declined down, as you can see, down to about 7% by October, and in November it's down to say just under 6.8%. Though that month is a little misleading because, as you'll see in the next table, employment growth did not exactly grow very high in November. So you probably are seeing people just not in the workforce, and that's biasing the unemployment rate down. So looking at U.S. non-farm employment growth, you see how in April and especially, in March and especially in April, the jobs fell off a cliff, and since then they've been being added back. Especially as you can see in June through August, we see rather May through August, you see a pretty big add back. Though in the subsequent months, especially in November, you'll see there's a pretty weak recovery. So that's got to do with the virus spreading again and just uncertainty and a lot of things happening. Could you go to the next slide, please? So, just in very general terms, this is a very different recession from prior ones because unlike the financial crisis, which had its beginnings in a real estate meltdown and or prior recessions involving an energy crisis or something of that nature, this was non-economic. The economy was pretty healthy coming into this. Maybe not gangbusters, but it was solid. This was a self-induced, basically people call it a self-induced coma. We had to shut down because of medical and reasons, and also just consumer demand concerns of the virus. This is the fastest economic collapse on record. And what makes this also distinctive is that the recession impact was very widespread. Pretty much this wasn't isolated to one sector. Pretty much all sectors have been impacted one way or another. And as we'll discuss, some industries have actually benefited, but by and large, many businesses have not. And then the question becomes, what will the recovery look like? And though we've got vaccines, they're very good news with vaccines that are on the horizon, and people are starting to get inoculated. We still have some uncertainty. I would say just 2 months ago there were some actual formulated expectations as to what the recovery would resemble. Would it be an L, which means it would be a very low, very slow recovery from the drop? A U, which would be a more gradual recovery but still pretty symmetrical. A W, which could be a decline, a recovery, and then another wave or two, and another decline and a recovery, or a V, which would be, I think, the most hopeful scenario, which would be the sharp drop and the sharp incline of recovery. I think at this point we think that the only V we are seeing is in the stock market. think the main takeaway is that the longer the pandemic affects us, and the virus is uncontained, the longer the damage to the U.S. economy. I mean, to give you a quick example, looking at the latest UCLA Anderson forecast, which came out, I think the press release was this just about a couple weeks ago. They're expecting, with the vaccines, two very tough quarters coming up, this quarter and the following, with a pretty solid second quarter recovery. Maybe about 6% growth, and then with GDP reaching by the end of 2021 somewhere where they were prior to the pandemic. You know, other people are less sanguine about it. So we'll see what happens. It really depends how fast the vaccines can be rolled out and how successful they are. We're in some tough times now. Could you go to the next slide, please? So market impact, we were seeing initially when this pandemic hit, there were massive sell-offs and declines in the stock price, in the stock indices. So in March 23rd, the DJI and the S&P, they fell over 30% from the December levels. Since then, interestingly enough, they're back to record highs. So things have definitely recovered on the index end, though there are some reasons for that, which may have something to do with the heavy tech weighting in the indexes probably help. Low interest rate environment, the PPP and other relief measures have probably bolstered things, and just some disconnect between the stock market and you know, the overall Main Street economy. But what we are seeing is there was a lot of increased volatility. So that was important for valuation purposes. The VIX index, which is considered the fear index of the stock market, was almost 83 points in March of this year, which is about 4 times what it normally is. And it went down to about 20 in early December, probably because of such calming effects as the election being over and the vaccine news, which is so positive. But we are seeing an increase in the margin, the volatility again, probably because of this cold weather, the horrible infection rate, and you know, still some uncertainty regarding the stimulus bill that we're hoping that's going to pass. Other market impacts: mergers and acquisitions plummeted in the second quarter of the year, as kind of would be expected, though activity certainly recovered thereafter. There may be some selection bias in that. I think the deals that have been made are probably the more robust companies, but nevertheless, deals have certainly increased. And then as far as the real estate market, I am sure many of our audiences can appreciate that there's been a decline in real estate income, increase in vacancies, foreclosure risks, a lot more negotiations between landlords and tenants. Next slide, please. I think that's yours, Jeff.
Okay, so with that market context, let's go back to litigation. Now we're talking the general principles of damage claims, whether it's a lost profits claim or the business valuation claim. This is with COVID, without COVID, doesn't matter. So first, none of this hopefully will come as news to any of you. But the damage expert assumes liability. That is, even if a damage expert's working for the defendant who says, I didn't do it and it's not my fault, you still assume liability, because you never get to the damages question if the defendant prevails on liability. So the only time it's relevant is assuming liability. We also typically assume causation. Now, not always, because sometimes the damage expert is responsible for testimony to establish causation. If it's an economic cause, very often the damage expert is part of that. If it's a non-economic cause, or perhaps better phrased, if it's a cause that the evidence will come from some other source, whether recipient witness or a different expert, then the damage expert typically assumes causation. So there's also a difference between legal causation and economic causation. I'm not going to go into it here. but that is often a relevant question, that the damages expert might assume legal causation, but not economic causation. So a basic principle is that a damage award makes the plaintiff whole, basically puts the plaintiff back in the position that it would have been in, at least economically, had there not been wrongful acts. One important thing to consider when doing damages, especially on the business valuation approach, is that risk is an element of economic equivalence. So if you say, I would have had the opportunity to make a certain amount of money or be in a certain business position, there's uncertainty in that position. There would have been uncertainty in that position at the date that the event has occurred. And that uncertainty is translated into risk and typically translated into discount rates or probabilities of success. And that is part of the responsibility typically of the damage expert. So how do you do it? Let's start up with, this is lost profits. This isn't the business valuation side. Typically in lost profits, the expert will work with the fact witnesses and perhaps other experts to defining what we call the but-for world. Now that's a phrase I use all the time. It may be one all of you are familiar with, but on the chance that some of you are not, what I mean by but-for world is the world that would have occurred but for the liability acts, or had the liability acts not occurred. So what you're going to do is typically compare the but-for world to the actual world. And you're going to subtract, and the measure of damages will be the difference between those two. In doing the but-for world and defining it, you talk about what are the elements of damages. Are there lost revenues? Are there avoided expenses? Are there lost rents? Are there whatever there might happen to be? And you also talk about the damages period. Now that doesn't typically mean it starts on a date and is constant and then ends on a different date. Sometimes there's a trend, sometimes there's a transition, sometimes there's a slow recovery, and we'll see some pictures of that in just a few moments. Typically, the next steps are to estimate lost revenues, how much revenue would have come in, recognize that those revenues would have also generated certain costs, such as you had to make the product and pay for the product you were going to sell. And you subtract those incremental costs, or alternatively, you talk about what profit margin you have on revenues and sometimes apply that. If there are future profits, you have to discount to present value. And again, we talk about risk here as well as just time value of money. So those are the general steps. So here's your basic structure. Lost profits at the top. Well, what is that? We break that down into its component pieces. In the middle line, it's the but-for profits, the profits that would have occurred, minus the actual profits, the profits that did occur. Now you can break but-for profits down into a but-for revenue minus but-for expenses. You can also break actual profits down into actual revenue minus actual costs. So that's a simple structure, and that is often the structure that's used. Now, equivalently, there's another structure, and the math is exactly the same. It's just a question of rearranging terms and subtracting, and that's this chart. Lost profits can be thought of as incremental revenue. How much more revenue will you get? Minus the incremental costs. How much more costs will you incur? So you can, if you go back to the prior slide, and I'm not going to scroll there, but if you think about it, that just says we're rearranging the terms on the bottom of that prior chart to get to separating the revenue terms and the cost terms and treating them separately. So that's the basic structure for most lost profits claims. So what kinds of losses are there? Perhaps the most common is that some harm occurs, there's some impact for some period of time, eventually that impact is ameliorated and the harm goes away. So there's some period of loss. But occasionally, the harm caused a complete destruction of the business. So there will be no recovery. And the question there is, what do you do? One way is to forecast continuing, what the continuing revenues and expense would be. But another way is to value the business and say that's what you lost. And that's one reason you get into business valuation when doing lost profits. And then third, you have a different one. It's really no different. It's just the facts are different, which is that sometimes you have a new business venture that either never got off the ground or barely got off the ground. And there you might assert you have losses because you didn't get to enjoy the benefits of that new business. But here you have problems, mostly evidentiary problems. There is the old rule, what was called the new business rule, which prohibited damages for those kind of circumstances entirely. Now that's an old rule, and in my experience, it started going out when I started in this business, 30 or 40 years ago. But now it's I'll call it a rule of reason, a reasonable certainty. Do you have a reasonable basis for making those projections? Some new businesses, maybe you do. For example, if it's a franchise and there are lots of other franchises that behave similarly. And new businesses without good comparability, the answer may be, nope, can't do it, too speculative. So let's look at some of these. And we're going to go through a whole series of graphs to sort of illustrate these concepts. First, we have, and as it says in the title, this is without COVID-19. We're just in classic damage world. You have some violation that occurred, let me back up. You have some business that's been operating for several years. That's why it starts at year 0 on the left. You have some violation that occurred 6 or 7 years into the history, which established some history that you can rely on. You have a fall off in the blue area of what happened to your profits. You have either an expected recovery or an actual recovery, depending on what the relative positioning of the date of trial is. You can imagine that if the fall off is very brief, that the date of trial may be after full recovery. But here in my illustration, the recovery is still continuing. And lost profits is the red section. That's the classic situation, which I trust all of you are familiar with. If the business is permanently impaired, not necessarily destroyed, you get this kind of a picture. The losses will be ongoing, and you have different issues, including how to capture the value of that lost value in perpetuity. You may have, as we described earlier, that the event caused a total failure of the business, either immediately or slowly, as the plaintiff tried to mitigate or tried to recover and then failed. Here you have the same kind of issue, but you have probably an even clearer example of loss of value of the business, and that may call for a business valuation approach. You may have another example where there's a likelihood that the business will fail, but it hasn't actually failed yet. It's just on the downturn. And you may have evidentiary issues about establishing that, yes, we're going to fail even as we try to fight our way out of it. But that's certainly something that could happen. And okay, so now let me turn to COVID. And COVID here really is just a stand-in for any major causative event that is not related to the Liability Act. This would, COVID may be a big impact, but so could lots of other things. If you were in New York City and after September 11th, you can imagine that that was a factor as well. So here you have the same lost profits graph that I started with, but you have a but-for world which says, you know what, because of COVID, you were going to lose some of this anyway. You were going to lose the area in white. So from an economic perspective, you have to adjust and say the lost profits is only the smaller area in red. Now, from a legal perspective, I will listen to counsel about whether it's appropriate to do this or not. You might say, well, back on the date of the violation, that wasn't anticipated, so I lost the full anticipated value. I can hear that argument, but I can also say, with hindsight, we have reason to believe differently. And so you'd have to deal with the picture that's on the screen there. Same thing on the permanent impairment. Well, did COVID lead to some permanent impairment? That also has to be taken into account. And so the lost profits is again a less than the whole loss. Essentially, you're attributing causation to two events, the Liability Act and the COVID Act, and having to separate them. Same thing on the total failure of the business. Was the business going to fail anyway with COVID? Now, maybe later, because in our example, the Liability Act occurs a couple of years after the COVID, Liability Act occurs a couple of years before COVID. So you have some loss that occurs before, but then maybe you were going to lose the business anyway. The analogy in the September 11th situation is if you had a Liability Act on September 10th, and then and you were operating a convenience store in the World Trade Center, how much damage do you associate with the Liability Act on September 10th when your business is going to be up in smoke literally on September 11th? I turn to lawyers to tell me what the right legal measure is, but that certainly has an economic impact. And if you have total failure of the business due to COVID, but you wouldn't have failed due to the violation, it was only going to be impaired and recover, you have the same kind of issue, different graph, different picture, different story, but all the same kind of issues occur. And finally, I can't remember if I have one more slide. Finally, you have the new business venture. Here, my example just says you had a little tiny business that's barely off the ground, was precluded from operating, tried to operate, but didn't do very well. Trials a few years later, maybe that blue triangle exists, maybe that blue triangle is a flat line. You project all these future profits. Are you going to get them? Good luck with that. With the right set of facts, maybe, but very often, no. And that's true with or without COVID. So let's think briefly about what kind of evidence people bring forth for lost profits. And this is both related to a non-COVID situation and a COVID situation. Certainly prior performance and profits is relevant. Trends, market trends, budgets can be relevant. How did you perform versus your historical budgets? Maybe if you always met your budgets and you have a budget for the projection period, maybe that's good evidence of what would have happened. Do you have other operations that were unimpacted, or does somebody else have other operations that were unimpacted that you can use as a comparable? Is there good data from the industry or from government about what kind of trends happened, and can you distinguish your poor performance and associate that with the Liability Act and assert that you would have behaved like these other people without the Liability Act? If the defendants took your business, sometimes their profits, or at least their sales, would be relevant. You said, those sales you got, I would have gotten those. Okay, good story, good argument. Can you support it? Maybe they have sales in geographies you don't operate, so you have to deal with that. And, we talked about projections. No, well, we didn't, because I'm talking different. This is a different assertion than your budgets. This is a projection you do for litigation. It has the uncertainties associated with something that was done for litigation purposes, but it's certainly something that is done and can be examined. And then are there other witnesses? The damage expert relies on fact witnesses and other experts to try to assemble the required information. So three general approaches to lost profits. Sometimes people talk about the before and after method. That is, I was making 10% profits and I was growing at 5% a year, and I would have expected that to continue. Well, maybe. And one of the things you have to do is say, are those trends likely to continue? With 2020 hindsight, do we have a basis to say that but for the liability acts, they would have continued? Or did the market slow down? Or would you have not achieved those anyway? You try to eliminate compounding factors. What else happened in the market? Was there good weather, bad weather? Were there competitors entering the market or not? Things of that sort. You can also use what's called a benchmark or sometimes a yardstick method, which essentially says, we would behave like this other entity or these other sets of entities or the industry or some comparable. And so we'll say we didn't, and we'll try to associate the difference with the Liability Act. And then third, there's the projection methods. Essentially, do you have projections that you can create or perhaps were already created that were unaffected by the bad act? There's evidentiary issues about demonstrating that they're reasonable and supportable. If you can, you might test the accuracy of the projection against other periods that were not affected. But those certainly, as a theoretical matter, are useful approaches. And then what do you measure? Well, most of what I've talked about is lost profits. That is the profits that you as the entity would have enjoyed and didn't. And we generally use that when we have a finite loss period, when we expect recovery of some sort. Sometimes you measure damages by saying, you know what, the value of the business declined. And that's my measure of damage because I own the business. I no longer have that asset. That is perfectly valid as a conceptual approach. In fact, for some cases, it's pretty much the only approach. Sometimes in real estate, it's the value of the real estate that happened as a result of the decline. Certainly, you know, the business burns down. The difference between the value of the property with and without the building is a good measure of damage. And sometimes you combine those. You do lost profits, say, up to the date of trial, and then some valuation of what happens past trial, or some other cutoff. But it's appropriate to be able to do that as long as you don't double count. You can't count the lost profits period in the business valuation period. So why do I say that that business valuation is a reasonable measure of lost profits? Well, it's because under valuation theory, they're really the same thing. Except we're going to see on the second half of this chart, they're really not the same thing. So the first half says, well, under the theory, the value of the business is just the present value of future cash flows. And damages are the present value of the lost cash flows, often in the future. So because the future profits are a component of business value, lost future profits can't exceed the business value. And to the extent that you lost all of the future profits, that's equal to the business value. QED, we're done, brilliant solution, lost profits equals loss of business value. Except it's not always true. First, business valuation is often done post-tax, and lost profits are usually done pre-tax. Why? Because when you win the award, you have to pay taxes on them. So there are subtle issues about adjusting for differences in tax rates or tax benefits, but if you set those aside, there's a pre-tax versus post-tax issue. You also have timing differences. We may now know more. What we knew at the time of the business valuation 2 or 3 or 4 years ago may be different than what actually happened since then, and that can inform our judgment. And so the numbers may be different. For some businesses, especially small businesses, you may have both lost profits and lost compensation to the owner. The owner works at the business, gets paid a salary. If the owner can properly claim as a plaintiff that salary, then you might have to deal with that separately. The business could have attempted to mitigate and failed. You know, I've heard it say there's an obligation to mitigate, or maybe there's just, you have to take mitigation into account when doing damages. But what if you mitigate and still fail? I understand under the law that is an appropriate element of damages. And so you have to take that into account. And then there's a discounting issue. The date of discounting matters. If you discount the date of trial, which is common for a lost profits claim, you get a different answer than if you discount back to the date of the event and then perhaps earn prejudgment interest. So you do get differences, and they matter. Will, is this yours or mine? I can't remember from my last one.
I think this is Will. I do some more stuff.
Okay, so I will pass it on to Will.
Thank you, Jeff. So right now we are going to segue into a little bit about business valuation, and we'll be covering many of the same ideas, only looking through a slightly different prism. So first, a really quick overview of the business valuation approaches to value. Three approaches we typically look at, just like we do for real estate, or I don't do real estate, I shouldn't say we, but that people, appraisers use to value real estate: income approach, market, and asset approach. Income approach, typically what we're doing is we're conceptually, we're looking at viewing the value of the business as the present value of future cash flow or economic benefit. And typically that's done either by looking at more than 1 year in the future, where we look at a discounted cash flow, typically would project out for maybe 5 years, maybe 3, maybe more. And usually there's a terminal or a reversion value at the end that we discount to the present. Or we do a capitalization, which would be we're looking at earnings that we think the business is representative of what the business can generate, and we convert that to a present value using a cap rate or capitalization rate. The market approach is, as it indicates, we're looking to the market, and essentially we're looking at transactions of what we, using our judgment, we think are reasonably similar, comparable businesses. And if there are two areas to look. One is the public stocks. If the company we are valuing is sufficiently large and we're able to find decent comparables, we can look to the public markets, develop things like revenue and EBITDA multiples and apply them to our company and come up with values. Otherwise, we look at the private market. We can look at, there are various databases of information, or we can look even at SEC filings and find purchases of private companies, and then we can develop multiples there and come up with value. And finally, there's an asset approach where we're simply looking at the balance sheet and we adjust the balance sheet components to fair market value. And typically when we're valuing a going concern, that can be unless we're valuing a holding company, that could be a problematic approach for an operating business, because we would be ignoring typically going concern or goodwill value when we just look at the assets. Anyway, next please. Yeah, thank you. So let's very quickly, we'll go through, and again, some of these are the same factors Jeff talked about when we discussed lost profits. I mean, the things that drive the calculation. Data valuation, obviously critical. And as we'll discuss, a value as of, say, January 15th of this year, when COVID, while it was around, was not, maybe you could argue the impacts were not known and knowable, the severity. The value as of January 15th would be quite different than the value as of April 15th. Cash flow and earnings impact business value. Obviously, the higher, typically the higher the value. Anticipated growth is another very important factor that drives business value. And the risk. We talked about the discount rate, the perceived risk of a business. Other things equal, a riskier business is going to require a higher discount rate, and higher discount rate translates into lower value. Market multiples and general sentiment as to the market in a certain sector also impacts value. You may have a business where there are a lot of buyers and enthusiasm, and the market multiples reflect that, and you'd expect a higher value for that business than one where there's not much interest and multiples appear to be low. And finally, marketability and liquidity. Depending what we're valuing, if we're valuing a minority or non-controlling interest, then lack of marketability and lack of control are very important to consider. Again, it depends on I think the legal stipulations, et cetera, but typically on a fair market value basis, that's important to consider. And even for a controlling business, you can have a liquidity discount because they simply can't be converted to cash within 3 days or so, like you could a publicly traded stock. Next, please.
Will, I've got an audience question for you.
Sure.
Experts argue very different assumptions in valuing businesses in good times. How do you think COVID-19 has impacted the potential for expert disagreements?
So, well, it's going to increase them. The bottom line is that even in good times, experts will disagree as to inputs that drive valuation. There's a recent article that talked about this, that during the last financial crisis, inputs like financial forecasts and discount rates were very volatile and subject to dispute. And the upshot of the article was saying that you can expect very much the same thing now. Essentially, it's hard enough to determine an agreed upon forecast in any time, but now things are, all bets are off. So I think you'd expect to see a lot more disputes and possibly wider variance in business values. So more fun. So as far as impacts on, let's just discuss briefly some of the impacts that COVID-19 has had on business operations. And of course, this is a bit of a moving target. Things haven't quite played out completely, but for some businesses, most of the impacts have been felt. On the revenue side, you've got lost revenue or deferred revenue, including price cuts in certain cases. Certainly, hospitality has been devastated by this, and restaurants. Despite the mitigation attempts. On the supply end, you've got disruption, you've got cost increases, and the unavailability of product, and freight costs have gone up. And on the human resource side, you have issues relating to keeping offices safe, cleaning. You've got absence and employee costs regarding the severance and absence and rehiring costs. Another cost which really translates into a potentially significant risk is the shift to many offices working more remotely, in that there are more that brings with it more IT risks and more cybersecurity risk. So not only are there costs in monitoring all that stuff, there may be future litigation issues related to that. And of course, you've got certain professional service costs and technological costs that have gone up, and you've got expenses related to things like termination of leases or renegotiating of leases and other broken deals and other contracts that just simply were disrupted because of COVID. Next, thank you. So overall, just how COVID has impacted business valuation. As I indicated, the data valuation is key. When were the COVID impacts known or knowable? And again, this is a little different than lost profit analysis, because we're not using the crystal ball. We're just looking at the date and time, a date of value, and we're looking at what's known or knowable at that date. And that's where the data valuation becomes important. The decreased cash flows, increased growth, impaired growth, increased risk, which translates into a higher discount rate or a lower multiple. And that typically can be driven either by external risks, which could be a business or industry is simply in a more vulnerable sector, like restaurants that are dine-in, or it could be something internal, like perhaps management just been relying on, and these may be risks that they've had all along, but they just get exacerbated by something like this: the key person risk, customer concentration. You lose one customer and it all hell breaks loose. You got impaired marketability, certainly during the crisis, that would impact value negatively. Lack of buyers, lack of interest in buying a business. More people businesses just in survival mode, let alone trying to acquire. And I think the bottom line one bottom line is that industry research and analysis becomes more important than ever in doing evaluation during COVID-19, because not one size does not fit all. And next, please. So very quickly here, as far as how COVID-19 has impacted business valuation, On the income approach, we're seeing that a multiple period approach is probably more appropriate now, simply because you can't just take 1 year, like the last year, and translate that into a value. You got to look at at how the business is going to recover. And on top of that, to get to some reasonable values, you may have to do scenario analysis, a good case scenario, a middling scenario, and a bad case scenario, and weight the indications of value. One thing that we take for granted a lot, typically, we probably shouldn't, but is the balance sheet. People tend to focus on the income statement and the projections, but in this period, we may have a forecast that says the company will reasonably get to a break even at a certain amount of time, a certain amount of years or months rather. Here we have to determine whether they're even viable, whether they can make it. So working capital sufficiency becomes very important. Again, a lot more value, because of all this, valuations require more research and analysis to figure out all this. And certainly management can provide those projections and really have a meaningful conversation that would obviously be helpful. As far as the risk in the analysis, typically practitioners are incorporating into the projected cash flows, maybe through a scenario, maybe through discounting the cash flows to reflect uncertainty, but they're also looking at the discount rate as well and increasing that just to reflect overall COVID uncertainty. The issue is just not double counting and really pummeling a value. Next, please. Market approach, there are other challenges related to that. One is simply that you can't just, if your current metrics are not indicative, you can't just use that to determine value. Also, this certainly was the case with real estate during the financial crisis, but at a certain point, you just may have limited current transactions that you can actually use. No sales. So that could be a challenge. Or the ones that you do find might reflect the survivor bias. They may be only the strongest, best companies that sold. So you might have that issue going on. There's something to be said to looking at public companies to try to determine what a discount related to COVID might be. And some people analysts have also used various ways to adjust earnings to get to a discounted multiple. Next, please. So the last approach, which is sometimes the step, not the stepsister, but whatever you call it, the orphan, is the asset approach. But where, as I said, it may not be that useful in a going concern situation, but now it's an approach never to overlook, because it very well could be that liquidation value is the most relevant or the highest value of a particular business. There may be some other issues in relying on an asset approach, in that there may be limited market to buy assets. And again, a liquidation method is likely to understate or ignore intangible assets. And finally, one thing to keep in mind, and I've seen this come up a few times, just because a forecast is more uncertain does not mean you default to a liquidation approach. And I've seen, I think, some buyers trying to take advantage of that situation and simply put their hands up. We can't forecast. It's too uncertain. The business is worth its book value. And that doesn't sound, that's not rigorous enough. That's not true. Next, please. So
Will,
finally,
another question, Will.
Yeah.
What issues have you seen in removing COVID-19 from financial results?
Well, this gets a little to this slide, but the idea is that if we want to remove COVID-19 from financial results, there's an issue as to what to adjust. There's an issue as to, because the issue is, as far as revenues, is how long is this duration of impact going to last? And on the operating end, you can think of businesses that many businesses have pivoted to how they're operating, where they're working more remotely. They've made some cuts on advertising and other areas. So you'd have to look at the P&L and see what can you really remove that's temporary and what's not temporary? Like, for example, there may be certain cost cutting that is transitory. Maybe some vendors gave you a break during this crisis, a concession, or maybe you cut back on advertising, but that's just because of this, because of what's going on and money's tight. At the same time, there may be other cuts, such as either cutting some fat off the payroll or simply working remotely. And that could be a permanent issue. So the issue is, what do you really, I don't think it's as easy, it's terribly easy to, it just requires some thought as to what to remove. And that brings me to this concept here. EBITDA is a measure, you're probably all familiar with EBITDA, which is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. That's a typical measure used to value to measure earnings, and usually you remove non-recurring expenses like a litigation settlement or something like that. A new measure that is EBITDA that I've seen bandied about, which means they're also trying to remove all the effects of coronavirus. And the idea is either for financial reporting or for borrowing or purposes, a company might want to simply sterilize, take that out, to show what the company would have done this year were it not for COVID-19. And the problem with that, of course, is that what does that actually tell you? It's a made-up number. It's not the history, and it's not necessarily the future either. So the question is, how long are the impacts going to persist? And again, can you isolate the impacts reliably? Hopefully we can, because we're doing that for causation, but this is more for a reporting purpose. And just in general, ratings companies have been pretty skeptical about using an EBITDA measure, but I've seen it being used. So, Jeff, I think it's up to you.
Okay, back to me. So now we're back to the sort of talking about business litigation issues. This is sort of a list, perhaps, a speculative list, if you will, of the kind of cases that might require COVID-related valuation or damage analysis. I won't read you the whole list. You can read it, and you will probably know this better than I. But essentially, it is those events that seem related to COVID, whether it's caused by the virus, whether it's the shutdown, whether it's wage and hour issues related to lack of employment or to discrimination in employment, whether there's breaches of contract and the whole force majeure issue, M&A, deals falling apart. There's at least one or two that have been in the newspaper about the Delaware Chancery, about deals that fell apart. And I think the ones I remember, there was after the trial, after the case was filed, there was a settlement and a price adjustment, and they went forward. Real estate, securities, all these kind of things could have COVID issues.
On that note, Jeff, a question for you from the audience. Other than lost profits or business valuation, have you seen other case issues where COVID has had an effect?
I have. One comes to mind. I recently did a case having to do with the issue of irreparable harm. And as you may know, in getting an injunction on this trademark issue, the issue is is the harm irreparable? Because quite often, if under, I think, the eBay decision, if not others, if the harm is reparable, that is, if the defendant could pay a damage award if one ultimately occurs, then you do not necessarily get the preliminary injunction. And my question, the one I was asked to address, was, given that the events in question happened unrelated to COVID, but simultaneous with COVID, whether there was any meaningful way to separate out the impacts of those two, or whether the lack of evidence in and of itself meant that that the harm could not be quantified and therefore was inherently irreparable. That was what my testimony was about. There's no decision yet, so I can't tell you what the judge thought of that issue, but that was the issue that came up recently. Anyway, back to our slides here. When thinking about COVID, and this relates back to the graphs I showed earlier, you have to ask yourself, was the business damaged? Was the business already failing? Was the contract non-performance attributable to COVID, and does that give you liability or prevent you from obtaining liability? Or is the pandemic a convenient excuse for something that was going to happen anyway? Those are questions of fact. Sometimes your damage expert can help you. Sometimes the other facts in the case have to be relevant. And so that's when you're saying, is the damage attributable to COVID? And then you have the other side. What about other causes? What's due to COVID and not defendant? When did COVID start influencing the business? Is that related to the Liability Act, or was it going to happen anyway? So it's just the mirror image of the first group. Causation is difficult enough in normal times. It may be harder to deal with here, just as Will said, rather, the uncertainties in business valuation are greater during COVID. Same is true for lost profits calculations. And with that,
I think we have time for one more question. I've got one more audience question, which is how do or will you get the data you need to make COVID adjustments in your analysis?
It's a good question. The answer is, I'm not sure, but we usually figure it out. By that, I mean, certainly some things are obtainable. Certainly you can get industry data, or at least you can expect to be able to get industry data on what's happened since COVID, and you can see whether what's happened in the restaurant industry or what's happened in the software industry or what's happened in this or that. It will be easier to get over time. So if you're litigating something, and the litigation is next year for what happened during COVID, there's enough time for that data to have been compiled and reported. If you need it currently, it's harder.
Absolutely.
But very often litigation is delayed. And it doesn't happen instantaneously. So you can get data like that. If you're trying to distinguish between, on a very specific company basis, between COVID and other causes, that might be harder. It might require more detective work or some qualitative evidence or testimony that is not necessarily quantitative data. The answer, as usual, is it depends.
Yeah, and I would just say also, if it's possible to get, data from the company itself, accounting data, assuming they've tracked this stuff. Some companies have actually tried to track COVID impacts, but that's often an aspirational concept.
All right, well, we have reached the hour mark. Will, Jeff, thank you so much. This was a great presentation. Audience members, as I mentioned, you will be getting your MCLE paperwork by email, as well as a copy of the slides. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.